This really is a fundamental transformation in the way that we eat, and it's being pushed as a kind of model diet for the global citizen of 2050.
In part 2, Raw Egg Nationalist talks about the oncoming reset of the global food supply and the big push behind it.
We're told to believe that it's inevitable and that there's no discussion or debate about it. You know, any sane, rational person would be totally behind abandoning the foods that our ancestors have eaten for 200,000 years to save the planet.
He shares an alternative solution to the problem of feeding the planet.
We could see a return to small-scale local agriculture in the West as well, and that would be one way of reasserting the primacy of the interests of ordinary people within the food supply rather than the interests of large corporations.
Moving on to the reset itself, so it starts with this Planetary Health Diet. Can you talk us through what's in store for us in this plan?
Yeah, of course. So at the centre of the Great Reset, and this is the argument of the book, the Eggs Benedict option, at the centre of the Great Reset is a fundamental transformation in the way that food is produced and consumed. And the World Economic Forum has this nutritional arm called the EAT Foundation, which was founded by billionaires, the Stordalens, I think, husband and wife. And they basically have come up, with the help of the Lancet, the medical journal, they've come up with this thing called the Planetary Health Diet, which is a plan for the first ever global diet. So, you know, there's never been a global diet that everybody on the planet eats, but the Planetary Health Diet, that will be the first global diet, the first truly global diet, plant-based largely. And the aim of the diet is to save the planet from climate change. You know, so we need to move away, as I say, from animal agriculture to supposedly less polluting forms of plant-based agriculture, and we need to feed 10 billion people by 2050. That's the main population projection for 2050, is that there'll be 10 billion people. So those are the kind of underlying premises of the Planetary Health Diet, that we need to do those two things: save the planet, feed the planet. And what it is it's the first ever global diet. It's a plan broken down by food types and macronutrients for the average global citizen of 2050. So, you know, you'll be getting X number of calories from grains, you'll be getting X number of calories from soy, X number of calories from nuts, and there's basically no place for any kind of animal products in this diet. So, I mean, it's detailed. It's laid out in a big sort of glossy pamphlet that they produced. They produced a big report about it, and so I look at that diet in detail in the Eggs Benedict option, and I talk about firstly what it is, but also why I think it's bad, why I think plant-based diets in general are bad, because they're maladaptive. But this is what's being pushed basically as this is the Great Reset diet. You will have a calorie allocation, a macronutrient allocation, and none of it will come from animal products at all. It will be soy, it will be legumes, it will be nuts, it will be grains, it will be vegetable oils rather than animal fats. You might have a small amount of animal protein. So I think it makes an allowance for something like a quarter of a small egg a day. But you know, it's minimal. I mean, this really is a fundamental transformation in the way that we eat, and it's being pushed as a kind of model diet for the global citizen of 2050, and it's not a conspiracy theory. It's absolutely not a conspiracy theory. This has the backing of groups like the UN, has the backing of NGOs. If you go on databases of scientific research like PubMed, if you type in Planetary Health Diet, you'll see studies that talk about the Planetary Health Diet, about the way that it will be better for people than traditional Western high-fat, high-sugar diets, etc. So it's well thought out. It's laid out in detail, and it has the backing of groups like the World Economic Forum, the UN, NGOs, governments as well, the scientific establishment, and I mean, as I say in the book, I think it will be a disaster for human health, but there isn't necessarily much of a sign of a real concerted pushback against this kind of vision of the future and the vision of the future of food. And that's what I try to do in the book, is to lay out the beginnings of what a pushback would actually look like, because I think that we really need a concerted political response to this kind of stuff, because it's a political project. I mean, it's kind of depoliticized, and climate change is depoliticized in many respects, because we're told to believe that it's inevitable and that there's no discussion or debate about it. Any sane, rational person would be totally behind abandoning the foods that our ancestors have eaten for 200,000 years to save the planet. The year of global boiling has begun, and we need to do something right now. We need to stop the cows from breaking wind. We need to do all this other stuff. We need to stop using our cars. We need to stop flying, etc. So I think the only real response can be a political response, and that's what I try to lay out, is the potential for a kind of populist vision of a populist response in which we assert the basic need to have animal foods in our diet. We say, actually you can't be a human without having access to these foods. You can't fully develop. You can't develop properly. You'll be malnourished, essentially, if you don't have access to these foods that our ancestors ate. And so we demand to have access. You're not going to take them away. And there are elements, I think, actually now, you're starting to see the beginnings, maybe, of a kind of movement in that direction. So Ron DeSantis in Florida, for example, has banned lab-grown meat. He's banned the sale and production of lab-grown meat, which is a great thing, really. I mean, free marketeers on the right will say, oh no, that's a bad thing, you shouldn't do that, let the market decide. But fundamentally the problem is that this plant-based agenda isn't being pushed by the market. I don't think that you can respond to it with the market. I think that you actually have to have a political movement. And so I think that was good leadership by Ron DeSantis. And when he made the announcement that lab-grown meat was going to be banned, he linked it to the Great Reset. He said, we have these globalist elites who want us to get rid of traditional agriculture, and lab-grown meat is one of the products they want us to eat instead. Well, actually, in Florida, no, you're not going to produce lab-grown meat. You're not going to sell it here. We support traditional agriculture. That's that. And other states in the US, I think at least 3 other states, have either enacted a ban now, Republican states, red states, or are in the process of doing so. So I think there are reasons to be hopeful, but also I think it's things are proceeding at quite a pace, and I think that as we reach 2030, as we get closer to 2030, as it becomes clearer that we're not going to meet the Paris Climate Accord, emission targets and all that kind of stuff, the hysteria will grow, and the calls for the abandonment of traditional agriculture, for meat taxes, for carbon taxes, is only going to grow. And so I do think that actually we need to get on our bike about this, because it's coming soon.
So you do offer a solution that doesn't involve eating any bugs at all.
No.
And can you talk us through it?
Yeah, of course. So the solution is the Eggs Benedict option of the title. So that's a riff on a book that was written by Rod Dreher called The Benedict Option. And so my sort of future of food is the Eggs Benedict option. It's I draw inspiration from a country that's quite unpopular at the moment, which is Russia. Unfortunately, maybe ill-timed, but they have done agriculture in Russia in a very interesting way. So the peasant mode of agriculture, the sort of peasant mode of cultivating your own food in your own garden, growing things, keeping livestock, etc., has persisted for 1,000 years in Russia, even through the Soviet period. So there was you had the great state farms, huge collective enterprises, but then you still had ordinary people with gardens, growing food for their own consumption, fruits, vegetables, etc., keeping chickens, maybe even some larger livestock. And it's called household gardening, that's what they call it. So it's been of interest in the permaculture world, in the world of sort of small-scale farming and people interested in organic farming, that kind of thing, for a long time. And there was a great PhD thesis that was written about Russian household gardening, about how productive it is, about how people do it, that I drew on in the book to make the basic argument that actually, if we want to escape this corporate-controlled food supply, if we want to regain power, if we want to regain control over the kinds of foods that we can eat, why don't we start producing food ourselves? Even in a small-scale, quite humble way. And that's where this Russian example comes in, because, these ordinary Russian people, in their millions, even today, produce food in their own gardens. I mean, Russia is 2/3 urban now. It's not a rural country anymore, and yet people leave the cities to plots of land in the countryside where they grow fruit bushes. And
so you're talking like allotments, like
yeah, basically, yeah. So it's something like allotments, but it's a very widespread thing, and they produce a significant amount of Russia's agricultural output. Right. Like a significant amount of. I've forgotten the precise statistics, but it was something like, like 90% of the potatoes in Russia are produced by ordinary people, and significant quantities of milk and eggs and fruit and all sorts of other, and vegetables and all sorts of other products are produced by ordinary Russians using organic methods on small plots of land that they have for themselves. So I try to make an argument that actually we could see a return to small-scale local agriculture in the West as well, and that would be one way of reasserting the sort of the primacy of the interests of ordinary people within the food supply rather than the interests of large corporations. So, as I've been saying, my fundamental contention is that actually the food supply serves the interests of corporations rather than the interests of the ordinary people it feeds. And so I talk about Russian household agriculture, how we could emulate the Russian model, how it wouldn't necessarily take all that much time or effort. I mean, during the growing season, Russians spend something like, which is 4 months in Russia, they spend about 17 hours a week in their gardens in those 4 months. Well, that's half the amount of time the average American spends in front of the television. So there could be no question that we've actually got the time to do this sort of stuff, and we've also got the resources. So the amount of land under cultivation by household gardeners in Russia is significantly less than the amount of lawns in private lawns, people's gardens in the US. So you've got the time, you've got the space. You could do it. I mean, it's hopeful. It's a hopeful. May even possibly be verging on wishful thinking, but nevertheless, I do think that the Russian example shows that you can have an industrial food supply, industrially produced food, so they still have big farms. Russia is a massive, massive agricultural producer. It's one of the most important agricultural nations in the world, as the conflict with Ukraine has shown. And yet also at the same time, alongside this industrial system, you have ordinary people producing the highest quality food for themselves. And so I think that's a model that we should try to emulate, and I think that it's a model that could be emulated, but whether it will be obviously or not, I don't know. And there are all sorts of barriers, and I talk about these barriers in the book, to a renewal of small-scale production. So there's a great farmer, quite a personality in the US, called Joel Salatin. He's been on Joe Rogan and is pretty famous. And he wrote a great book called Everything I Want to Do is Illegal. So he's a small-scale farmer, and he talks about basically just how heavily weighted against the little man the American system is of food production. So he's a small-scale farmer, and he can't do things like he can't slaughter his own chickens, he can't sell raw milk, he can't do this, he can't do that.
Sounds like Jeremy Clarkson.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I think that it's exactly like Jeremy Clarkson, and that's been very eye-opening actually for a lot of people. But it's true, you think that there are things that a small farmer should be able to do. Well, actually, they can't. But a conglomerate can do it because they've got the money. I mean, if a conglomerate wants to slaughter chickens, it builds a slaughterhouse or it buys a slaughterhouse. But the small-scale farmer who actually would like to produce, organic food for the local community is hamstrung, and so that doesn't happen for the most part, or they do it at very close to a loss, and so it's demoralizing and difficult, and you don't get as many people doing it as should. But actually, I think if you change the regulatory system in the US, if you made it easier for small-scale production of food, if you incentivized it, then it could happen. But that means a political campaign. So again, I'm very, very clear in the book that if there's going to be any change to the US food system, it will have to be a political campaign, because it needs root and branch reform, really, and encouragement and incentivization.
I just wanted to also touch on some of the historical aspects with you. So you say that this is not the first great reset of our food system. Can you talk a bit about the Neolithic Revolution?
Yeah, of course. So so I start the Eggs Benedict option with a discussion of the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic Revolution. So that's the advent of agriculture, basically. The first real adoption of agriculture as a mode of subsistence, the emergence of the first urban settlements in the Near East about sort of 10 to 12,000 years ago. So, I mean, humans had practiced a sort of primitive form of farming, primitive sowing of grains. They harvested wild grains, but then they also started in a kind of quite a lazy way to sow wild grains and harvest them. But then there was this huge change that took place about 10 to 12,000 years ago that's basically seen as the dawn of civilization. So, man created agriculture, and then you could produce food surpluses, and that meant that you could sustain cities and urban centres, and that meant civilization, that meant writing, that meant commerce, that meant it kick-started history, basically, the agricultural revolution, the production of grain surpluses through farming, through fixed field farming. But it's actually becoming quite clear. There's sort of more recent scholarship on the agricultural revolution. I draw very heavily on the work of a man called James C. Scott, who was an anthropologist. He wrote a very good book called Against the Grain about the agricultural revolution, and about the fact that actually we have this triumphalist sort of narrative about the agricultural revolution, which is basically just what I said. It's the dawn of civilization. Thank God for agriculture. It brought us all of this. None of this would be possible without agriculture. But actually, if you look at the skeletal record, for example, and other evidence, it becomes very clear that early humans didn't want to become farmers. They were forced to become farmers. There's very clearly an element of coercion, and what it actually looks like happened is that you have outside groups coming in and basically enslaving people and making them become farmers to produce agricultural surpluses to support these new urban settlements. So it's a more complicated picture, and I refer to the agricultural revolution for that reason as the first Great Reset, because I see it as a kind of a forced change of diet that is also a fundamental social transformation as well. So the Great Reset is a fundamental social transformation. It's about changing totally the way that we live, but it's also built on changing the way that we eat, and it's very clear that that's what happened in the agricultural revolution, is that you had a change of diet that produced a totally different kind of civilization, and it wasn't a change that anybody was asked whether they wanted to sort of take part in. They were basically made to take part in it. and if you look at the skeletal record, then you'll see, for instance, that the first farmers were heavily malnourished.
Right.
For example, a grain-heavy diet is not the best, and by comparison with their hunter-gatherer ancestors and their hunter-gatherer peers, they were smaller, less robust, malnourished. They show all sorts of deformities that were, like women, for example, who would have been on their knees all day grinding grains with pieces of stone. They have awful sort of knee deformities, bone deformities, bone spurs, that kind of stuff. So fundamentally, I mean, what I'm trying to say in the book when I talk about the agricultural revolution is that we've been here before, basically. We've been here before, and we need to understand that food isn't just food. I mean, we tend to, in our age of plenty and prosperity, we tend to think that food is just like the air. It's just there, and it doesn't matter who produces food. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It's just there, and we can eat what we want, and we can go to the supermarket and buy what we want. But actually, control of the food supply is as important, if not more important, than control of any other resource. It's as important as control of oil. It's as important as control of the energy network and energy supply. And the agricultural revolution, the events of the agricultural revolution, this first Great Reset, dramatized that, I think, in a way that has some quite eerie parallels with what's going on today. So I'm trying to using my historical knowledge, my training as an historian, trying to show people that actually, all of the kind of things that I'm saying will happen with the Great Reset, with this fundamental transformation of diet, happened before, and actually even that we might expect some of the same nutritional deficiencies as show up in the skeletal record from the agricultural revolution, because they were eating plant-based diets and they were malnourished, and they ended up being shorter than their ancestors and their hunter-gatherer peers. And there's no reason to believe that actually we might not, our children or grandchildren, if they're forced to eat a plant-based diet, might also end up shrinking in stature and displaying the same kinds of effects of malnourishment, physical degeneration, that we see in the archaeological record from that period. So it's it's a comparison case, and it's setting the scene, I think. But I don't think it's a frivolous comparison at all. I think there's genuinely something to it, and I think that it's something that readers of the book actually have been very, very interested in, and it's kind of unexpected. And they've said, actually, that really opened my eyes and really made me think again about what what it means for the food supply to food supply to change, for control of the food supply to change, and the fact that actually it's not just food, it's more than that, it's everything.
One other historical aspect in your book that particularly was of interest to me, you talk about the mid-Victorian times. I'd have thought, tough life, malnourishment. You say something quite different in there. Could you just tell us about that?
Yeah, of course. So there was a very interesting study that was published, a historical study a few years ago. I think it might even have been about 10 years ago, about the mid-Victorian diet. So this is sort of middle of the 19th century, Victorian Britain, and surprisingly, the people who lived in Victorian Britain at that time were probably as healthy as anybody who has ever lived in Britain. So there was a marked increase in basically in every single indicator of good health. So you see that people are taller, for example, and this is because they're eating nutrient-dense animal foods. So there was a period at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution where people, the beginning of the 19th century, where people were moving to towns and cities and conditions were very tough. But then you have a period of rising prosperity where people are able to consume things like fish and meat, and they're growing things in their garden, they're growing fruit and vegetables in their garden, etc. and so what you actually see, rather than what you think, is you actually see that people are getting healthier, people are getting taller, and it was kind of like a golden age for health. It really was. But then what happens is the beginning, this is sort of at the end of the Victorian period, 1870s, 1880s, you start to see the process that Weston Price describes that I talked about earlier, the emergence of canned goods and the first factory-produced foods on the scene. And then you see the same kind of physical degeneration that Weston Price saw. So, for example, at the end of the Victorian period, the British Army had to lower its entrance requirements for height significantly because suddenly people were getting shorter. I mean, within a generation, because they were consuming these factory-produced goods, refined wheat products, and that sort of stuff. And you know, famously, people often talk about the Boer War and about the fact that, you know, so many people turned up, so many British men turned up at the recruiting stations, you know, to volunteer for the Boer War, but then, you know, a significant proportion of them had to be turned away because they were in such poor health. You know, like 25%, maybe might even have been more than that, I think. So yeah, so there's this sort of paradoxical kind of golden age in the middle of the Victorian period, where actually people who had moved to cities went back to eating the kind of foods that their ancestors had eaten back on the land, and yeah, everybody was better off. And in a way, and so I talk about this in the book, in a way it's almost like a sort of test case for what I'm advocating, which is, you know, let's move away from these industrially produced foodstuffs. Let's go back to whole foods, locally produced, and, you know, maybe we'll have another golden age of health.
Charlie Cornish-Dale, Raw Egg Nationalist, thank you for joining us.
That was a real pleasure. Thank you.